Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I can't believe it's the beginning of September. This is my birth month. It's always such a nice time of year because the seasons are changing and the weather is just so beautiful. And this year I'm turning 45. I can't quite believe it. And so I wanted to share that we're actually going to be taking a hiatus from the podcast. We have a few more episodes in September. And then at the end of the month, I will be taking a break. We've been doing this for many, many years, and I need to focus on a few other things that we have going on in the business. So I just wanted to let you know that we will be back at some point, I am sure. But for right now, we're just taking a much needed rest. And I say all of this just to thank you all so, so much for being avid listeners for all of these years. I can't tell you how much I've appreciated your support during this time. And like I said, we hope to be back in the very near future. Alrighty, let's get to this episode. So today I am joined by Kelly Slovin, a dedicated sports dietitian and expert on relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS, with a background in helping athletes and active individuals fuel their bodies for peak performance. Kelly brings both professional expertise and personal experience to the discussion. After navigating her own journey with hypothalamic amenorrhea, or HA, which she now identifies as REDS, Kelly has become a passionate advocate for educating others about the critical importance of proper nutrition and menstrual health. We delve into the nuances of REDS, exploring how it differs from the older concept of the Female Athlete Triad, and discuss why maintaining a regular menstrual cycle is vital for athletes. Kelly shares insights on the detrimental effects of overexercise and underfueling, and highlights the key signs and symptoms of REDS that athletes, coaches, and healthcare providers should be aware of. Additionally, we touch on the challenges in researching female athletes due to menstrual cycle variations and discuss strategies for long-term management and prevention of REDS. This episode is for anyone who has experienced hypothalamic amenorrhea, REDS, or very irregular cycles, and it's also for you if you're an athlete or you train hard on a consistent basis. And before we get into the episode, this is a reminder that you can get a free 7-day trial on the Fix Your Period Collective, which is my brand new membership platform that gives you personalized information about your menstrual cycle. Make sure to take my detailed period quiz to get answers to all your period and hormone problems, and sign up for the membership via the free trial at fixyourperiod.com. Hi, Kelly. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Same. As we were just talking about, this is going to be such a juicy conversation. And it's something that I've wanted to talk about on the podcast for so long. So I'm thrilled that you're here. And I
Amazing.
figured we could probably start with understanding what REDS actually is. Can you explain what relative energy deficiency in sport is and how it differs from the older concept of the female athlete triad?
Yes, absolutely. So, as you said, it is an acronym, Relative Energy Deficiency in Sports. The definition of REDS is it's impaired physiological and psychological function as a result of low energy availability, which is a mouthful. So, in other words, it is kind of like an expanded concept of the female athlete triad, which that is low energy availability, menstrual dysfunction, and low bone mineral density. REDS is looking at a much bigger picture. There is a much broader spectrum of symptoms that can come from low energy availability, which is under eating compared to the amount of energy you are expending. So REDS is specifically a diagnosis for athletes, but I like to look at athletes as a little bit of a looser term than just someone who is a collegiate athlete or a professional athlete. It really could be anyone who is an active individual and finds themselves in either a team sport or an individual sport on a pretty regular basis.
Right. That's so, so helpful. And I was going to actually ask you about that. Like, who gets this? Because I know we're going to talk about athletes and people in sports, but I feel like anyone can develop this condition.
Yeah, certainly. If you're an active individual, if you like to run races or participate in team sports, this certainly could still be applied to you.
Okay. All right. But what about like someone who is just working out really hard type of thing? Is that
Yeah,
a different situation?
it certainly could be applied. If the situation is kind of overexercise. And most often, if that's the case, they might also be exhibiting some sort of disordered eating habit. So likely that's more the route that a provider would take, is treatment of that, than necessarily calling it REDS. But I would say it certainly falls under the spectrum.
It does. Okay, that's helpful. And
Yeah.
so your personal experience with hypothalamic amenorrhea is something that I wanted to talk about too. So you were diagnosed, I know you were diagnosed with this at one point, but you've said to me prior to this that you would diagnose yourself with REDS actually if you were in the present day. Can you share your journey with this condition and just include maybe like how you recognize the symptoms and sought help?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, having hypothalamic amenorrhea, at one point I was put on hormonal birth control as the form of treatment for that, which kind of just masked the symptoms for a little while. The symptoms of that birth control drove me crazy, so I got off of it anyways and still had a missing period for a while. I did not have a lot of support from providers on treatment. It was sort of my own kind of figuring out on my own, trying to figure out supplements and what was possibly going wrong, not knowing that it was a result of just simply not eating enough. I was a very active individual. I was a swimmer in high school and participated in group activities in college as well. And that's really when I was experiencing it. And some of those other things I was experiencing at the time that I didn't really realize were related was like extreme fatigue, some pretty serious GI symptoms. I just assumed, oh, I must have IBS or something that no one's diagnosed yet. And was kind of struggling with really focusing in school as well. And so these are all things that fall into signs and symptoms of REDS. Whereas when we're just looking at it as hypothalamic amenorrhea, those other symptoms aren't really being considered as part of the big picture. So I had no idea at the time what was going on. I didn't learn about REDS until I went into my master's program to become a dietitian, which was long after my recovery. Um, which I mean, kind of makes sense. REDS was a term, became a term in 2014, so it really is kind of new in the medical field. Um, but that being said, I certainly wish I knew more of what was going on and who to even speak to about it at the time, rather than figuring it out many years after.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because obviously there are a lot of health implications that you might experience, not only in the present, but long term. So, how old were you again when this happened?
I was in high school when I first experienced my period loss, and it kind of traveled throughout college.
Okay, so it went on for a number of years. And do you see
Yeah.
that with most of your clients too?
Yeah, I have a lot of people tell me like, "Oh, my period's always been irregular," or "It's been missing for a long time," or maybe they lost it for a while, came back, lost it again. Like it really varies across the board, but a lot of people do experience like this has been happening since I was a lot younger, and now in my adult life, it's still an issue that I'm struggling with.
Right. Okay. And what about the prevalence in different stages of the menstrual life cycle? Is there a time that it typically happens more often, like you said, in your teenage years or something?
Not necessarily. I mean, I would say as like teenagers in general, that is a time that there's a lot more social pressures contributing to maybe wanting to intentionally underfuel. REDS can certainly occur from unintentionally underfueling as well, like just having that lack of nutrition knowledge, or even lack of resources for cooking. But yeah, there's not one age group that it can really affect. And when we are thinking about the menstrual cycle, those symptoms related to it in general, if someone's a lot younger when they do start experiencing this, it may mean getting their period a lot later than would be expected. So there's a lot of different things to look at than just losing your period as well.
Right, right. And so, speaking of that, in terms of essential knowledge for providers, so you mentioned not knowing who to go to or even knowing you should go to someone. What are some of the things that healthcare providers should know about REDS to effectively diagnose and treat the condition? And also, who should you go to if you are experiencing this? Do you just go to your OBGYN as a start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in terms of who to go to, if you can find someone who kind of advertises themselves as a REDS informed provider, that's going to be best case scenario, but most likely that might not be what's accessible to you. So a sports dietitian or a sports medicine physician, again, more likely to be aware of RED-S than just your general practitioner. Of course, if you do have a general practitioner or an OBGYN who you trust to share these symptoms with, and you can tell them, like, I have these concerns and I think it's a bigger problem than just like my missing period or just my GI symptoms, then by all means, that's great. But someone who specializes in sports and even specializes in RED-S is gonna have a lot more resources and already have that background knowledge to be able to help you and look at what's going on.
Right.
What I would, want other providers to know is that every RED-S case really is going to look different depending on what may be the cause. Again, as I said, there could be unintentional underfueling, intentional underfueling, and also looking at that whole picture, like screening for the common signs and symptoms, such as the loss of period or, low bone mineral density may mean more frequent injuries or poor recovery from an injury. There's a lot more going on as well. So even like growth chart trends, for example, that can show us if something started to change at a certain age and give us a better picture of where to start telling the story of this underfueling that they're experiencing. Or blood work can really give us a good idea of if they do have low levels of estrogen, vitamin D, thyroid hormone, all of these different things that are interconnected outside of just that loss of period.
Right, of course. Yeah, I know. I feel like if you lose your period, then that's just like sort of one piece of the puzzle, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also know roughly 50% of athletes are on hormonal growth control. So looking just at that loss of period isn't even always going to tell us the story because that's going to be masked by the hormones that they're already taking.
Right. So this is a huge issue. And, it's something that I actually had a conversation about yesterday on social media. So I shared this post yesterday about having a period. Well, an ovulatory cycle is necessary. And by
Mhm.
extension, you have a period because you had the ovulatory cycle. And so, in my opinion, this is necessary because it's an indicator of so many aspects of our overall health, obviously. If anyone has been listening to this for long enough, they know that I say this ad nauseum. But someone commented and they were like, well, female athletes lose their periods all the time. So, what's the big deal? It was kind of like, well, and I was like, yeah, I know that happens, but it doesn't mean that it's physiologically normal or biologically
Mhm.
normal for that to happen. And so I feel like there's this normalization of that. And then these female athletes are put on the pill as a treatment for that, as you were. I don't know if that's still very widespread, or as you said, there's more awareness now of RED-S and what is happening. But I'm curious about that 50% of female athletes being on the pill. Is it because of conditions like this, or is it for other reasons?
I actually don't know, and I don't even know if there is research on it. The research
Yeah,
on women's health is so limited, but then take it into sports and it's even more so limited.
right.
I mean, when we are doing research on female athletes, a lot of it is on like colleges, because it's kind of easy to have that group of people already there. And so I would assume they can be on it for a plethora of reasons, not just because they've gone to their provider for a missing period.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess this leads me into, more about the importance of menstrual health for athletes and why should athletes, particularly female athletes, be concerned about these missing their periods. Because like I said, this person was just like, so yeah, they lose their periods. And I've had other people say that too, like, oh, it's just sort of the nature of being an athlete. Can you speak to that? This idea that, yeah, if you're working out really hard and you're training really hard and you're performing, that's, sort of a given that that might happen to you.
Yeah, I kind of what you just said, always am saying just because it's common doesn't mean that it's normal or healthy. So it's not really a good excuse to kind of brush that off. And unfortunately, it's still kind of not very well known in the coaching world that that is a big concern because they just see people come in year after year, lose their period, and move on. So that is partly where I think some of that misconception comes from. Because if a coach isn't concerned, then that athlete probably isn't going to be very concerned either. But there's a lot of reasons why you should be concerned about that missing period. First and foremost, the long term health consequences can be pretty grand. as well as, being able to have longevity in your sport. So a lot of athletes actually can still perform at a high level while experiencing low energy availability and REDS, but that's going to be short term. So maybe they are still able to perform at their upcoming swim meet or this race that's coming up and do really well and get their best time. But eventually that's just going to all crash and burn. They'll either get an injury, they'll kind of plateau and really be wondering why, like, why am I not able to push myself further at this point? And it's usually that's the reason is undetected REDs. So that longevity in sport certainly is a big one, especially for athletes to have their buy-in, so to speak, on the condition. But, in the short term, some things that could pop up could be, as I mentioned, GI symptoms, poor sleep, bone stress injuries, difficulty recovering from, an exercise that you used to be able to recover from easier, also difficulty recovering from injury. So if you're taking longer to recover from an injury than was expected, this could be what is kind of an underlying concern. It also can have a lot of effects on our mental health, which oftentimes is overlooked as well. Some of the more like nitty gritty things that you could be going on are like irritability, decreased motivation, difficulty concentrating. But our brain really is fueled by the energy that we eat. Like the primary source of energy for our brain is glucose, which we get from carbohydrates. And so if it's not getting enough, it's pretty sensitive to that. And it can have some pretty negative impacts on our mental health as well.
Oh, yeah. I could not agree with you more. I think that generally speaking, we have grossly underestimated how critically important those ovulatory hormones are, our estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, to our physical and mental health. And I can't even imagine. I just know what it's like to be in that kind of deficiency without having to perform, you know, in
Yeah.
like a really serious sport. I truly can't imagine what it must be like when you are in that situation and you do really have to perform at your best. That must be so challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And, performance, whether you're well fueled or not, is going to be a stressor on the body. So if you add in the fact that your body doesn't have enough energy, it really can create chronic stress pretty quickly. Like it can start to snowball and be a lot of stress on the body. And it's just why all of these different systems start to get affected and um, can really kind of plateau, as I say, where the athlete is in their journey, and it can feel kind of sudden if they are able to perform at a high level while experiencing this if it's not going diagnosed.
Right. And do you know any stats on that? Like how long some women go, or like what the average is to getting a diagnosis, or how long they might go undiagnosed?
I haven't come across any statistics like that for REDS. Um, there really is kind of limited research on it, given that it's only been around for like 10 years. It can be pretty long term to recover, which can be part of the tricky part with getting, again, that athlete buy in to really understand the big picture with what is going on, because no one wants to have to stop doing their sport that they love, stop doing that activity that has kind of driven them to this point, um, just to kind of recover from something that they may not even be able to see in the exact moment that they're in.
Yeah, for sure. And so are there any other implications of amenorrhea or, REDS on overall health?
Yeah, so it really does affect every system on the body. It can affect our endocrine system, our cardiovascular system. As I mentioned, the GI system, like this is one that really kind of goes under the radar a lot of time because there are so many GI disorders that can be coming up for these athletes, and we can easily say, oh, maybe it's an intolerance or sensitivity to this food or that you feel like has been hard to digest. But if you think about, when you're in a state of stress, you're probably not hungry, you're probably not thinking about food in that minute, and that is because it's not your body's top priority when dealing with stress. It's going to focus on the outside factors. And so when we're in this state of chronic stress as a result of REDS, our body's going to really slow down that digestive system, slow down metabolism, and have difficulty digesting food. And so the extreme bloating, the diarrhea, constipation, gas, like these can all be a result of REDS. And it may feel like it's from certain foods in the moment because those foods may be harder to digest, But at the end of the day, it really is that low energy that your body has that it can't really put into digestion at the time. And so for a lot of people, when they go through recovery of RED-S, they can suddenly tolerate all of these foods that they previously thought were sensitivities and intolerances because they were giving them so many discomforts in the moment, but it really was that lack of energy and not the food itself.
Yeah, yes, I can definitely relate to a lot of these things, especially after coming off of the birth control pill. And so what about, I'm just thinking about like clients you've worked with or people you've worked with who have experienced this. And um, I'm just thinking about like how you start to get back on track. I mean, even for your own personal experience, like what was it that, really started to help you move the needle, or what did you even start with first? Because I think that this can feel very overwhelming. I imagine, especially if you've been experiencing it for so many years.
Yeah, that's a really great question. First and foremost, from a provider standpoint, we're going to work on increasing your food intake. For some people, that may look like certain food groups have to get added back in. For others, it may just really be going back to the basics of fueling for being an active person and how much your body actually needs. Because, coming back to that stress, like a lot of people lose their appetite from exercise because it is a little bit of a stressor on the body. So you may not realize that you need that amount of energy intake from food, even if you are prioritizing your nutrition. So that can be a really tricky part for athletes in particular. And a big thing that I do work on with them is, being able to acknowledge when your body needs the food, even though it may not be telling you. So that really is the initial step. In more extreme cases, sometimes we do have to step back on their activity level as well, which can be a much trickier part. Um, Hopefully, they don't have to completely cease activity at all, but if, cutting off a few miles a week or taking back a couple training sessions can help progress recovery faster, then it certainly is the ideal situation for a lot of people. And then, all of these different puzzle pieces that we were putting together with the symptoms will also start to fall into place as the energy intake increases. So, most often, we don't have to do too many of these other things to address all of the different symptoms, even though it seems like, oh my gosh, your whole body is being affected by it. At the end of the day, increasing food intake is going to have the biggest impact. So, a lot of people also ask about supplements. There are a time and a place for these supplements. Sometimes they can help like push the needle a little bit and give that body that extra boost to start moving forward because it's already working super hard just to maintain its general activity level, let alone performing in a sport. So sometimes supplements can help. A lot of times they are can be a little bit misguiding. They're not going to be the only thing that helps. That's one of the things I got tripped up on when I was younger, not knowing what the problem was. I was reading about all of these supplements that are good for women's health, good for your menstrual cycle, and adding those in wasn't going to be the only thing that was going to get me to full recovery. Like, honestly, at one point, I did get my period 1 month from these supplements, and I was so excited. And then it never came back again because at the end of the day, I wasn't eating enough. And that's much more important than the individual supplements.
Oh, yeah, completely. So I'm thinking about like what one needs to be eating. I know it's so dependent on the sport that they're doing and various other parameters, but how much do you recommend someone be eating? And, like what kind of macro balance should they be aiming for? I think that having that kind of understanding of the basics of what you should be aiming for might be super helpful for someone who might be in a situation like this.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of macros, there's really not any specific percentage breakdown that I would recommend for every individual person. As you said, it might depend on the sport. Generally speaking, for an active individual, I like to say having like half your plate being carbs, quarter of your plate being protein, and a quarter being fruits and vegetables is kind of going to get the job done. Um, but it really depends on the person. Just making sure that you do have all of the different macros, you have your carbs, protein, fat is going to be really important. And then when looking at someone who is super active and doing exercises on a regular basis, we do want to look at kind of the more specific details of when they're fueling around that activity as well. So making sure they're always having something before their morning workout. Even if it's super early, getting something in your system is going to help. If you're exercising for a more long period of time, like marathon runners, for example, we want to make sure that they're fueling during the run as well. And then that post exercise refueling is also super, super important, not just on protein. I think that's where social media kind of leads us astray sometimes, that protein is kind of the end all be all for athletes, but carbohydrates are extremely important for refueling the body as well, because that's the energy that our body really is using when exercising. So we want to refuel those energy stores so that we can get on with our day and not feel completely depleted, even just trying to like walk up the stairs or carry groceries, for example.
Wow, yeah, that's so, so helpful. And what about early warning signs that, coaches or trainers, or I mean, anyone really, parents can look out for to identify athletes who may be at risk of developing REDS? Are
Mhm.
there signs prior to it happening?
So one of the first things to be affected by, not really eating enough is going to be the menstrual cycle. That's typically the first system to go. Our body doesn't necessarily need our reproductive system to survive. So that's what it's going to kind of cut costs on, so to speak, as we're trying to still, give energy to the heart and the brain and the muscles and all of these other things. So that, a missing period is going to be the most common initial thing that someone experiences. As we said, about half of that population is going to be on hormonal birth control. So that may not even be a useful thing to be looking out for. But when it comes to parents, coaches, athletic trainers, some of the other things to pay attention to are, are there any noticeable changes in this person's diet? Like, are they suddenly talking about changes that they're doing? Or maybe someone who's sitting down for a meal with them notices that they start cutting out carbs or things like that. Um, Also, if it is more like a team sport setting, adding extra exercises on top of what you're already being given, that is a pretty good indicator for, an outside party to look at and say, something else might be going on here. This person might be pushing themselves a little bit too far at this point. And then, some of those more mental health based symptoms as well can be, again, a little easier for an outside party to see than maybe that person themselves. So if they are, again, like starting to struggle in school when they used to be a straight A student, or they're getting a lot more irritable than they used to, um, that could be something that someone like a parent or a coach would notice before the athlete is coming to them like, hey, something feels really wrong.
Right. Yeah. That's so great. And I'm, so curious about uh the strategies, I suppose you could say. Like, do you always recommend that someone who is experiencing one of these conditions, do they always work with a sports dietitian or someone like you to start to get things back on track? Like, can they do this themselves? Like, what I know, obviously, like the nutrition piece is so huge, and food comes first. Ultimately, like that's where our fuel comes from. That's like how we're going to start to heal our bodies. But do you recommend they work with maybe someone like you in addition to other people? Like, what kind of team would one put together for addressing this condition? And I imagine it depends on the severity of it too.
Yeah, the treatment team can vary depending on what they're experiencing, as well as what may be some of the underlying causes. So, a sports medicine physician or your general practitioner would likely be playing a role. We do want to be testing lab work and following body weight trends just to make sure we are on the right track, especially if we, this person did get to a point where we started to see effects in like, their vitamin D levels, their hormone levels, things like that.
Can you
A
talk a little bit more
dietitian.
about that, by the way, the
Oh
testing,
yeah.
like what testing you would typically do in a situation like this?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Okay.
honestly, your general blood work panel is going to be really helpful because vitamin D and iron we're always going to be wanting to look at. Estrogen is also another big one, so we can get an idea of the trends related to their hormone health. Um, the thyroid hormone is also a good one to look at, as well as leptin. I know we're talking mostly about females here, but testosterone we would also want to look at for male athletes. Those are some of the most common ones that we'd be paying attention to. If we had the resources, like a DEXA scan, like a bone density scan would also be really helpful, but that's not always in the cards. So sometimes with this, it really does depend on the resources available because it can be kind of hard to access like regular blood work and all of these other things that can help us track what's going on underneath.
Okay. That's so great. And is there anything else with regard to like management strategies or anything like that? Like what I was asking about initially prior to the blood work?
Oh yeah, yeah, the treatment team. So a therapist would sometimes be involved depending on what the situation is. You know, if there is an eating disorder, disordered eating that is playing a role in the cause, that would be super helpful. Or if there's, as we said, some of those more mental health effects, again, could be really helpful. Dietitian most often is going to be a part of it. Yes, someone could essentially, work on this recovery on their own. It might take a lot longer, and ideally, you'd at least be checking in with your physician to check in on some of those lab work levels as we were talking about, and following along. But in an ideal world, a dietitian would certainly play a role because most likely there's going to be some sort of nutrition education component that will be super helpful in the recovery process.
Okay. And you mentioned eating disorders or disordered eating. Is that usually a big piece of this puzzle?
It can be. Yeah, it certainly can be. Um, Especially in younger athletes, the pressures to look a certain way, to perform a certain way. Maybe they're looking up to their favorite professional athlete that does what they do and they look different than they do. Um, that can be really challenging for a younger athlete. So that certainly can come up a lot. It's not the only thing that's playing a role here. Some people genuinely may just, not know what they need to be eating. For example, like someone going from a high school sport to a college sport, there's going to be a big change in their training plan. They may not be aware of how much more food they need to be taking in to accommodate that change in their training. So eating disorder screening is definitely a big piece of the puzzle, but just because someone doesn't have an eating disorder doesn't mean they can't have reds. And just because someone has an eating disorder doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get reds.
I think that's very, very helpful. It's good insight.
Good.
And I'm thinking about sort of the long term uh, prevention, I suppose you could say, of this recurring. And, I always talk to my clients about the fact that this conversation with your menstrual cycle and your body is pretty much a lifelong one. we, we
Yeah.
don't get to just fix this thing and move on. Unfortunately, it doesn't work quite like that. So I am curious about how that works with something like REDS. Uh, do you see a lot of like relapsing? Is this, once you're diagnosed and treated, like what are some of the long-term strategies for managing and preventing the recurrence in a female athlete?
Yeah, absolutely. That's certainly something a dietitian can be helpful with because they can really give you the tools to not just be able to really tune into your body and know what it needs in certain situations, but also the tools to know kind of what changes you might need to make in your diet when your exercise routine is changing as well. Um, as far as relapse, it's not necessarily something that is always going to happen or is super common to happen. Again, like one of those things I don't really have statistics on, but
More
one of
just
the
in your
more
your patient population than anything.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, one of the more likely things I'd say in regards to that would be if, an eating disorder is at play here, then if, someone is going through a more difficult time later down the road, then that would be when we want to start looking into the whole picture again and checking in on all of the other potential signs and symptoms that could be popping up. Just to really make sure that we're getting ahead of things as quickly as possible rather than waiting for it to get to a place of, I feel like everything is wrong right now and I need help. Um, that is certainly one of the other things that I would look out for.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think that's really, really useful information too. And just so important for us to sort of have that reminder that once these things go wrong, like it definitely takes a significant amount of time to start to address it. And I am curious from you, just from your own experience and maybe that of women you've worked with, like what is the time frame for getting things back on track? I mean, I think like once you're in that state of severe depletion, I'm constantly reminding my own clients of this. Your body, it took a long time to get here. It's going to take some time to recover. And so I'm curious, like what kind of expectations you set for someone who is trying to recover from this condition.
Yeah, it is another one of those things, unfortunately, can vary a lot. So it's
Yeah.
hard to have a straight answer. But I will say, ideally, I'd want to be checking in with someone for at least a year. Even if I'm not seeing them on a regular basis for that long, I'd want to check in every couple of months, make sure that we can get the blood work, make sure it's still where we want it to be, see if there's any changes in body weight, um, things like that, that we can just kind of make sure they're still on the right path if we know that they've, gained that education, increased their nutrition to where it needs to be and have gone on their way. We do just want to make sure that their body is still going in the direction that we want it to be.
Mhm.
Something that may slow it down is if we are working more so again on that eating disorder, disordered eating side of things. We're going to be needing to address that eating disorder alongside what is going on in their sport and the underfueling. So for some people, that journey can take a bit longer than others.
Yeah. Oh, I'm no doubt about it. I agree. I mean, it's highly individualized. And I'm just thinking about whether you've had to advise women to stop doing the sport that they're doing based on, whatever their circumstances are. Has that ever happened?
Yeah, it can be really, really tricky, especially when, it's a big goal that they have. I personally work with a lot of runners, so usually that goal is a race. And so there is an end date. And if we can't get to where we want to be in time for that training season, I would end up advising them not to run that race. And that can be very challenging. It can be a very difficult conversation, but a lot of times at the end of the day, the reason behind it is so that they can continue to run more races in the future. We don't want them to run that race and deplete their body to the point of, having this really long-term recovery needed, rather than if we were to address it sooner, then we can get ahead of things and prevent things from getting worse. And as I was saying earlier, like affect their longevity in their sport.
Right. A little bit of short-term sacrifice for the long-term gain.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not fun in the moment, but when we are looking at the bigger picture, it certainly is usually the best option.
Yeah, I can imagine that that is very challenging to navigate as a practitioner.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially when there's like big goals. Yeah, and the potential for all kinds of accolades and things like that on the other side.
Yeah, especially in sports, most goals are not on your own schedule. You may be a college athlete and the goal is within the semester or the year, or you're training for a race or some sort of big event. So that certainly is the tricky part with recovery, when, there's a date in the back of someone's mind and we kind of have to work on their own schedule instead.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. I'm just curious about raising awareness or advocating for better support systems for female athletes who are dealing with REDS and amenorrhea, because you said earlier, like coaches aren't really clued in many cases, and even OBGYNs don't really know this term. And I get that it's a newer term, but I feel like the female athlete triad has been around for a long time. So it's not that new of a concept, but I am
Mhm.
curious if there is any movement in sports organizations or governing bodies that contribute to the effort of raising awareness and advocating for, better systems for this, or support systems for this condition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've certainly talked with plenty of providers and coaches and athletic trainers who are very aware of this and are working within REDS. Um, and so I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but there certainly is a big lack of knowledge and awareness in the field. And so I think really the first place to start with increasing it is with the providers, the coaching staff, everyone who is there to help support the athlete. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are looking out for them. They're the ones who are providing advice and education to them. And so if they're aware of the potential consequences of, maybe giving them the wrong nutrition information or ignoring something like a missing period, then that's going to be really helpful for the entire sport, rather than each individual athlete who hopefully would be aware of when they should be speaking up and asking for help with something that feels wrong. But I definitely think the first place to start is with the coaches and the training staff who are helping them.
I
In
feel,
terms
oh,
of,
go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
No,
Oh, I was gonna,
I was just going to say really quickly, I was just thinking about my partner Hayden, who used to row. He rowed um for his university. And he was like, we just used to eat like a pack of spaghetti for dinner. Like that was, it was just like a massive bowl of carbohydrates. Like there
yeah.
was absolutely no education on food or nutrition or any of it like 20 something years ago. And he was like, I feel as though things have really changed quite dramatically. And so I am curious about that. If things have shifted, just not to where we need them to be yet, obviously, but I do get the sense that things have changed in terms of like how athletes are fueling.
Yeah, they definitely have. I mean, the science has grown a lot. I mean, nutrition as a science itself is relatively new compared to a lot of other things. Um, but for sports nutrition in specific, we know a lot at this point that we really can help hone in on a lot more specifics depending on the sport and depending on the level of activity that they're doing. The thing that still gets in the way that can be easy to forget when I'm in my own little bubble of nutrition is that social media really plays a big role in a lot of the lack of education, so to speak, and promoting things that aren't necessarily going to be helpful for that specific population of athletes or promoting things that may be just completely wrong to begin with, unfortunately. So, despite how far we've come in sports nutrition and what we know that we can do to help athletes be their best selves and hit their peak performance, there's also a lot that we are kind of fighting against that is a big part of why a lot of people find themselves in this position of reds, because maybe the advice that they were seeing just led them in the wrong direction.
Oh, yes. Oh my gosh. I know. The advice that they got led them in the wrong direction. I feel like that's just what it is to be a woman these days, navigating our health. I
Yeah,
swear it's so
seriously.
challenging, right? I just see it all the time in my work, and I have no doubt that you do too. And that's, I think, the most challenging part of trying to work with women these days is that there's just so much information coming at them constantly, and a lot of it's conflicting and extremely confusing, and some of it's very polarizing. And I think people are just burnt out from it, and they don't really know who to trust or what to do. And I think that's so hard, because then it just puts you into a place of like inertia, and you're just in an analysis paralysis type of situation. So hats off to anyone who's working with patients these days, because it's really just so difficult, I think. And even more so for the consumer, who is just trying to figure out like what actually is best for them. And so, yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I imagine it's heightened in your field of work.
Yeah, no, it really can be so confusing and so frustrating for the general population with all of the different information that they're hearing out there. And the kind of, I don't know if crazy is the right word, but kind of crazy thing about nutrition is like it really does come back to the basics. Like what's best for you is having your fruits and vegetables, having protein and carbs on the plates. Like we don't need all of these extra supplements, these really specific diets, the tracking macros. Like a lot of it isn't necessary, and some of it can be helpful in various situations, but that's the kind of funny thing. Like the best nutrition information is kind of the boring information. Like it really is taking it back to the basics.
Yep, I know. I say that all the time, but no one's interested in that. I'm like, you don't need the $1,000 worth of testing, I promise. You just need to do these foundational pieces as a very first start.
Yeah.
And then we see where we go from there.
Yeah, it's not always as quick of a fix as some of these fad diets are kind of quick to change things, which I think can be the tough part too, is it is a little
Yeah.
bit more of a long-term process to get to that point than, following some of these other things that we're seeing online.
So true. I know. Well, where can everyone find your work and what you do in the world, and how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Kelly Slovin Nutrition. I do also have a website, also Kelly Slovin Nutrition. If anyone is interested in Red's education for their sports team or their providers, their coaching staff, whoever it may be. I do also see clients one-on-one at a practice right now called Michelle Pilipetch Nutrition. So you can also find me there. So a lot of different ways to get in contact with me.
Amazing. Kelly, thank you so, so much. This has been really, really enlightening for me. Like I said, I know some of this stuff, but I'm just not at all immersed in this world. And so I really do appreciate your knowledge and all of the hard work you've put into this because it's so critical. It's such critical information for women athletes to have. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for giving me yet another audience to chat about Reds too, because that's what I really love to do.
I can see that. Thank you. That's a wrap. Be sure to click that subscribe button to join me for more Girl Talk Gone Menstrual in upcoming episodes. But in the meantime, check out my latest Period Party episode. And if you're looking for a deeper dive into your hormones, go ahead and take my period quiz at nicolejardim.com/quiz.